There is a photograph in the archives of the Library of Congress that has no explanation. It was taken sometime between 1860 and 1870. The subject is a man seated in a studio, dressed in the formal clothes of his era. His posture is composed. His expression is unremarkable. He looks like every other man photographed in that decade, a minor figure preserved by the accident of sitting in front of a camera at the right moment. Nothing about him is unusual. But behind him, mounted on a wooden stand in the background, is a device. A cylindrical object with what appears to be a curved reflective dish attached to one end, connected by a thin wire coil to a flat rectangular panel resting on the table beside him. Look at it long enough and something uncomfortable happens. You recognize it, not because you have seen this photograph before, because you have seen this technology before, in a different century. No one photographed with that kind of equipment in the 1860s. That equipment did not exist in the 1860s. The device in the background of that photograph would not be formally described, patented, or manufactured for another 6 decades. Archivists who have catalogued it list it as unidentified mechanical apparatus, and then they move on. That is the part that should bother you, not the device. The moving on. This is not the only photograph like it. Across the major archives of Europe and North America, in collections at the Smithsonian, the British Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and dozens of regional historical societies scattered across cities that no longer remember what made them important, there are photographs that contain objects that should not be there. Not fantastical objects, not ray guns or flying machines or anything that would trigger immediate dismissal. Objects that look exactly like technology we recognize. Technology, we have been told, was invented at a specific moment by a specific person in a specific place, appearing in photographs taken before that moment ever happened, before that person was even working on the problem. The standard response when these photographs surface is one of 3 things. The object is misdated, the object is misidentified, or the object is a coincidence, something that merely resembles the technology we are projecting onto it from the vantage point of the present. Those explanations deserve scrutiny, because they are not always wrong. Misdating happens. Misidentification happens. The human tendency to see familiar shapes in unfamiliar objects is well documented and real, but those explanations are applied reflexively, before investigation, in a way that closes questions rather than opening them. The assumption is that the timeline is correct and the photograph must be wrong. That assumption has never been seriously examined. And the number of photographs it has been used to dismiss is larger than most people know. When you look at enough of these photographs, a different picture begins to form, one that has nothing to do with time travel, one that has nothing to do with the paranormal explanations that tend to swallow this subject whole and make it impossible to discuss seriously. The picture that forms has everything to do with how invention actually works, how the historical record of invention gets constructed. Who controls that construction? And what gets systematically erased when the financial interests of the people who own patents are powerful enough to rewrite the past in their own favor? Technology does not arrive in singular moments of genius. That is the story we tell because singular moments make for clean history, and clean history is easier to teach, easier to fund, easier to build institutions around. The reality is messier. Technology arrives in parallel, across multiple people in multiple places, often with decades of prior development behind the version that eventually gets officially credited. Ideas travel through correspondence, through published papers that get read and forgotten, through visits to other laboratories, through conversations at conferences that no one bothered to transcribe. The version that gets credited is almost always the version backed by capital, protected by aggressive patent enforcement, supported by the kind of institutional documentation that archives have the resources to preserve, organize, and make searchable. The versions that came before, the laboratory photographs, the workshop images, the portraits of forgotten inventors standing next to devices that would not be officially invented for another generation, those end up in boxes, mislabeled, underfunded for cataloging, donated to regional archives by families who did not know what they were donating. Sitting in storage waiting for someone who never comes. Start with the most documented case, because it is the one where the evidence is impossible to dismiss. In 1901, Guglielmo Marconi received the credit that would follow him for the rest of his life, and eventually to his Nobel Prize. He transmitted a wireless radio signal across the Atlantic Ocean. The history books for most of the 20th century opened the story of radio exactly there, with Marconi, with 1901, with a moment of triumph that gave a clean origin point to an entire technology. But there is a photograph taken in 1882, nearly 20 years earlier. It shows a laboratory space in rural Colorado. The equipment in the frame is not simple. There are coils wound to a precision that suggests deep understanding of electromagnetic principles. There are capacitor arrays. There are antenna structures of a design that no one working within the accepted timeline of that decade should have been able to build. The man who built that laboratory was Nikola Tesla, and the patents that Marconi would later use to claim his Nobel Prize were in 1943, ruled by the United States Supreme Court to have been Tesla's patents first, not similar to Tesla's patents, not inspired by Tesla's patents. Tesla's patents, filed earlier, covering the same ground, belonging to a man who had already understood what Marconi would later be given credit for discovering. The history of radio did not begin in 1901. The highest court in the United States said so formally and on the record. But ask most people today who invented radio, and they will say Marconi without hesitation. Because the photographs of what existed before 1901 were not catalogued as evidence of prior art or prior technology, they were filed as curiosities, as documentation of the eccentric workspace of a difficult man who never successfully commercialized his ideas. That last phrase is the key to everything that follows. Commercialization, not invention. The revisionist economic history of technology is not really about who had the idea first. It never was. It is about who had the capital to make the idea matter. And making an idea matter means patents filed correctly, lawyers retained expensively, relationships with regulators maintained carefully, and a public narrative constructed deliberately. Tesla had none of those things in sufficient quantity. The photograph from 1882 existed. The Supreme Court ruling came eventually. Neither one changed what most people believe. Consider what happened to Philo Farnsworth, because it is the story that makes the economic mechanism clearest. There is a photograph from 1927 showing a young man in a farmhouse in Rigby, Idaho, standing next to a glass tube contraption he built from components ordered through a mail order catalog. The components were not exotic. The catalog was not specialized. What was extraordinary was the understanding that assembled those components into what they became. That glass tube contraption is a functional electronic television transmission device. Farnsworth was 19 years old when that photograph was taken. He had conceived the core principle of electronic television while plowing a potato field at 14, at a moment when the physical labor of the field and the abstract logic of electron behavior collapsed together in his mind in a way he later said he could not entirely explain. He understood that an electron beam could scan an image the same way the parallel furrows of turned Earth lay in sequence in front of him, row by row, building a complete picture from individual lines. He went home and drew diagrams for his science teacher. His science teacher kept those diagrams. They would become important later in ways no one anticipated at the time. In 1930, RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, the largest and most powerful communications company in the country, sent an engineer named Vladimir Zworykin to visit Farnsworth's laboratory. Zworykin was not sent as a courtesy. He was sent as an intelligence operation. He spent 3 days in Farnsworth's lab studying everything Farnsworth had built, asking detailed technical questions, taking notes that he was not there to share with Farnsworth. He returned to RCA and told the company's president, David Sarnoff, that he wanted 10 months and $100,000 to replicate what he had seen. Sarnoff's response has been quoted many times because it is one of the most honest things a powerful man ever said about how power actually works. RCA does not pay royalties, they collect them. What followed was 11 years of patent litigation, not because RCA had a legitimate claim. Because RCA had lawyers and Farnsworth did not have enough of them. RCA had money, and Farnsworth was spending his fighting instead of building. RCA had access to politicians, to regulators, to the informal networks of influence that shape how institutions interpret rules in ways that never appear in any official record. A farm boy from Idaho with a mail-order laboratory and a science teacher who had kept his early drawings had none of those things in sufficient supply. The patent system is designed in theory to protect inventors. In practice, it protects the parties with the resources to navigate it most aggressively and most expensively. 11 years of litigation meant 11 years of Farnsworth's patents being tied up, challenged, appealed, reinterpreted, and delayed by a corporation that understood that time was the weapon. Patents expire. Delay long enough and the invention becomes public domain regardless of who built it first. When television became a mass commercial reality in the late 1940s, it was RCA's name attached to it. RCA's technology in the official story. RCA's engineers credited with the breakthrough. Farnsworth's patents had expired, legally exhausted by the delay tactics of a corporation that had calculated correctly that it could outlast him. Farnsworth died in 1971 in circumstances that were quietly devastating. He had watched the technology he invented at 14, built at 19, and spent his entire adult life fighting to keep, become one of the defining cultural forces of the 20th century without his name attached to any part of it. He told his wife near the end that he felt he had failed, that the thing he had given his life to had not been worth what it cost. His invention had been used to broadcast the Apollo 11 moon landing to hundreds of millions of people. He watched that broadcast in silence, in a room where no one around him knew what they were watching on or who had made it possible. His name was not mentioned once during the coverage. The photograph from 1927 still exists. It predates everything RCA ever claimed by years, and for decades it was simply not part of the story that anyone with the platform to tell it chose to tell. The economic structure that buries inventors did not begin in the age of corporations and patent lawyers. It is older than that and in some ways more nakedly brutal, because it operated without even the pretense of legal process. In 1839, Louis Daguerre was presented to the French Academy of Sciences as the inventor of photography. The ceremony was significant. The French government purchased his process and released it to the world as a gift to humanity, a gesture that attached the prestige of the French state to a specific name and a specific moment. What the official ceremony did not mention, what was not part of the announcement, what was kept carefully away from the public narrative being constructed that day, was Hippolyte Bayard. Bayard had developed a direct positive paper print process independently. He had arrived at it through his own work, his own experimentation, his own understanding of chemistry and light, and he had demonstrated it publicly 2 months before Daguerre's official announcement. 2 months. The French government, which had already committed its prestige and its resources to Daguerre, paid Bayard 600 francs. 600 francs to be quiet. 600 francs to delay his own announcement long enough for the official story to solidify around someone else's name. 600 francs is what the invention of photography was worth to the man who actually developed one of its earliest forms. Bayard did not disappear quietly. He responded in the only language available to a man with no institutional power and no legal recourse. He made a photograph. He posed himself as a drowned man, hands folded, eyes closed, slumped in the posture of a corpse. On the back of the print, he wrote that the subject had been dedicated to science and art, that his long devotion had brought him nothing but bitterness, and that he had been driven to this end by the neglect of a government that had chosen to put someone else's name on his discovery. He titled it Self-Portrait as a Drowned Man. It is the first known political protest in the history of photography. That photograph exists. It is preserved. It appears in art history textbooks and photography retrospectives as a fascinating and somewhat eccentric curiosity from the early days of the medium. The economic argument it makes, that institutions choose which inventions become history based on political commitment and financial interest, and not on the question of who actually discovered what, is almost never the part that anyone teaches. Nikola Tesla died alone in a hotel room in New York City on January 7, 1943. He had been living in the Hotel New Yorker for the last decade of his life, increasingly isolated, increasingly short of money, working on ideas that the scientific establishment had long since decided to stop taking seriously. Within hours of his death, not days, not after appropriate notification of family and colleagues, but hours, agents from the Office of Alien Property arrived at the hotel and seized everything. Every document, every notebook, every letter, every technical drawing. Every piece of correspondence that could be found in his rooms. The official justification was national security. Tesla was a foreign national, born in what is now Serbia. The materials he had accumulated over a lifetime of scientific work might, the government determined, contain information relevant to the ongoing war effort. The seizure was conducted before any family member or professional colleague had been informed that Tesla was dead, let alone consulted about what should happen to his papers. A government physicist named John Trump, uncle of the future president, was assigned to review the seized materials. His report concluded that Tesla's late-period work contained nothing of practical scientific value, nothing that posed a security risk, nothing that would have justified the urgency with which the seizure had been conducted. What that report did not address, what it could not address, was what had already been removed from the collection before the review began. The inventory of what was seized in the hours after Tesla's death and the inventory of what was eventually returned to his estate do not match. Researchers who have spent years, and in some cases entire careers, attempting to map the gap between those two lists do not agree on what was in it. They agree that the gap exists. They agree that material is missing. The photographs taken by Tesla's colleagues at his Colorado Springs laboratory in 1899 show electrical discharges of a scale and character that the official history of electrical engineering says were not achievable until decades later. The photographs are real. They have been authenticated repeatedly. The technology shown in them remains, by the official account, ahead of what should have been possible at the time they were taken. That official account was written and codified after the documents were seized, and before anyone outside a classified government review had seen what was in them. Come back to the original photograph, the one that started this. The man in his formal clothes, seated in a studio somewhere in the mid-Atlantic region of the United States sometime between 1860 and 1870, his posture composed, his expression giving nothing away. And behind him, on a wooden stand in the background of a photograph that was supposed to record nothing more significant than the face of a minor industrialist, a device, a cylindrical object with a curved reflective dish, a wire coil connecting it to a flat rectangular panel on the table. no one has identified it conclusively. The man himself has been identified, records connect him to business interests in the region, to the ordinary commercial world of his era. No known connection to any laboratory, no known connection to any research institution, no patent filings, no correspondence with any of the figures working on the technology the device resembles. But someone put that device in his photograph, someone built it, someone in that room understood what it was for well enough to have it present, mounted, connected, arranged as though it belonged there as naturally as the chair and the table and the painted backdrop. The question the photograph asks is not whether someone in 1865 invented a technology we associate with 1925. That framing leads toward the paranormal explanations that make this subject easy to dismiss. The question is simpler than that, and more unsettling because of its simplicity. How many times has this happened? How many photographs are sitting right now in archives across the country and across the world, in boxes with incorrect labels and insufficient funding for proper cataloging, in collections that have never been digitized and never will be, with archivists who note the anomaly in a handwritten log, and then move on to the next item, because there are 10,000 more items and no resources to investigate any of them? How much of what we call the history of invention is actually the history of which inventions were capitalized, which were patented aggressively enough to survive litigation, which were written into the record by people with enough institutional power to make their version permanent and everyone else's version invisible? Photography is indifferent to what it records. It does not know which version of history is supposed to be true. It does not know that the timeline it is contradicting has been agreed upon by powerful institutions with strong reasons to maintain it. It captures what was in front of it, a lens, a chemical process, light hitting a surface and leaving a mark. Whether or not the institutions that came after had any interest in explaining what that mark showed, the photographs are still in the archives. The objects in them are still unidentified. The institutional machinery that decides which questions are worth asking is the same machinery that decided in 1839, and in 1901, and in 1927, and in 1943, which version of invention became history, and which version became a box in a storage room that no one has opened in 40 years. The device is in the photograph. It has been there for over a century. And in all that time, with all the resources that have been directed at understanding the history of technology, and the history of science, and the history of the century that photograph was taken in, nobody with the power to get a real answer has looked at it and asked the only question that matters. What is it? Who built it? And what happened to everything else they made?